It's
Hey friends, Ernie here with Don, and we're here today to talk about macro signals. It's an exciting technology that's been in development for, nearly a decade, I believe. And this technology is like the next generation. Now I think what we're on, 8 generations or something like that. We're way out there.
version 18.
18 generations. That would make it about 1,642 years old. Anyways, macro signals are the next generation of our PatternCast technology, where we used to just do signals on individual assets. This now is combining a wide range, actually all the assets that we look at. And what's the current tally now? What is the macro signal made up of? What asset classes or sectors make up the macro signal?
The macro signal looks at 90 different stocks. It looks at stocks across Dow components, technology, and we added real estate last week.
And my understanding is that that's as of today, but at some point in the future, we'll be able to do, I guess, theoretically, all the stocks.
Right. So as an update, the programmers working on version 19 say that by Friday we'll have the ability to test, and this is real technical stuff that people would probably be bored to hear all about, but we'll be able to test, say, 500 stocks at one time, which means we'll be able to do the S&P 500 or certainly do any sectors that we want. The software now is a bunch of component parts that are all automated, but you have to hand hold between the components. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but the new version on this that supposedly I'll have access to on Friday will automate it in such a way that we'll be able to do sectors in seconds, what takes now days.
All right. And so what's the advantage of us creating this macro signal? I mean, the PatternCast signals for individual assets is just fantastic. Generally, we choose assets that have a pretty long history of data because we like lots of data. But now that we have this sort of conglomeration of all these different assets, we have a huge amount of data just coming from all these different assets. What is the advantage of these macro signals? What does it do for a trader as opposed to maybe looking at an individual asset?
Well, we sort of found these by accident. Back in February, we were looking and we were just noticing that when on any group of assets, each evening we look at how many buy signals that we get, what PatternCast calls buy signals. And when the number got low, we noticed that the market would sell off based on historical data. And we hadn't noticed that until February. And then right after we got our first, what we call macro signal in February, the market, the broad market sold off and it dropped whatever it was, 4,000, 10,000, I don't know what was it, 11,000?
33%.
Right. So that sell-off was preceded by a shrinking number of buy signals on individual assets. So we did some more work and we found that when you look at large groups of assets, you can see what we think it's like watching a herd of buffalo move, or it's like a flock of birds or whatever. PatternCast looks at individual assets. The macro signal looks at the basket, and we think it gives a much better picture of where the broader market's going to go.
So it's interesting when you showed me the representation of the macro signal. And it was going up and down, and then you said, "Hey, flip it, and then superimpose it onto the S&P or the broader market." And so I did, and it looked just like the broader market signal, but with a slight difference. It was about 2 days ahead of the broader market. It was as if we took the broader market, but it was a prescient signal 2 days ahead of the real market.
Well, what's interesting about it is the macro signal itself is a number that is it's an aggregate number of the buy signals we get across multiple sectors. It is not based on price.
Right.
So when you look at the macro signal, and when I told you about flipping it and all that, it's weird that the macro signals are mirror images of the market when the macro signals are number one, not based on price. They're just a number of buy signals. And the second thing is all of the macro signals are derived from data from before January of this year.
Right.
So everything they do is based on what happened 20 years back and stopped at January of this year. And so we've used those for projections this year. And then you flip it and it looks like the market. So that was just.
So in other words, it's not really looking at price action. What it's looking at is patterns that it recognizes, that it has identified in data sets that existed a long time ago and don't have anything to do with the current, maybe last 4 or 5 months of data at all.
Right.
It just finds patterns, and then it says, hey, I found all these other patterns in the past, and it kind of looks like what we're heading into right now.
Yeah, well, the way the pattern recognition is extremely complicated, and I'll save anybody who thinks they know what we're doing. It's not just based on price. It's not based on volume. If people were super technically interested, we could talk about how we drive these patterns, but you can take any variables you want. You could send me an email and go, hey, I think these variables would be, great to test. We could test anything from 1 to 1,000 different variables, and everything. I just got to be clear, everything that PatternCast looks at uses data that came from the past. It's not using current data. We're not curve fitting. We're not forward looking with our data. That's what's so spooky and surreal about the results we get, is that it's all based on the past. And we're talking patterns with thousands and thousands of variable. It's very complicated.
It's almost like it's learning the behavior of these assets from the way they performed in the past. And even though it has nothing to do with the price action, it can still recognize maybe the characteristic of that particular asset. And it finds commonality in it.
And one thing that I've said since the beginning about PatternCast is I don't understand why it indicates what it indicates. I don't understand it. We have found it. We see it. It's there. And I don't say that I've created anything. I think I've discovered something. These algorithms show us something which was always there. It's not technical analysis. Someone the other day said it was more organic. It was more like looking at life than it was looking at numbers. So, but it's not based on price action. We're not saying, what the candlesticks look like or anything like that. It's a whole different deal. And I don't know why it works. I don't know.
Well, I mean, we have an idea of how it works and what it does and all this other stuff, but why it all comes together so neatly is kind of a mystery.
I understand how the components work together. I know what we find, but I don't know why what we find works. What I mean is, if you give me a pattern that is ABC 1, 2, 3, whatever the pattern is, I don't know why that particular pattern over that particular time period did what it did. Right. I know that it did what it did. I don't know why. I know how we find them. I don't know why they work, if that makes sense.
Well, it just seems that PatternCast goes back and takes all these different aspects that you feed into it, all these different, I like to liken it to phrases or alphabet that you put into it, and then it mixes and matches it until it finds the right combination that seems to work. Who knows?
I don't know. Look, I mean, there's people out there that are way smarter than me that know more about markets and technical analysis and all that. Maybe they could say why these things work. But keep in mind, for example, that if we have a pattern with, let's say, 5 variables, and each variable has 5 different states, you're talking about 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 in terms of the number of potential patterns that could exist. Then you take that over, let's say, 90 different vehicles, and on any given evening, there's no way the human mind could even remotely comprehend how this is doing what it's doing. I mean, why it works.
Okay, but let's face it, we don't care because it works so well.
Well, I mean, I would like to know more. I'll admit I'm curious about why these things, but I am honored and happy that we found this stuff. But yes, you're right.
And the fact is that, you know, when just in the individual asset class, it's just remarkable how prescient it is. Now it creates what I often describe as sort of what if scenarios, and it says, hey, look, it looks like the market's setting up this way. And so it's telling us, if it does this, then you might be able to expect this.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I've heard you talk about that before. You're right about that. It comes up with scenarios, and that's kind of cool, because that means we don't have to be in the business of predicting. I don't have to say the market is going to do this or it is going to do that. PatternCast says, this is a scenario that under these circumstances in the past, this is what we saw. So if this happens, then statistically, this other thing should happen statistically. And there's no guarantees. I mean, nothing, there's no 100%, but it really allows me to not worry about having to predict things. Come to find out, predicting things is pretty hard. And PatternCast doesn't predict.
But in fact, it gives you so many different scenarios that it's easy to say, hey, look, here's a whole group of scenarios that perform really well. Let's try these. And so you get to try this sort of basket, and then find the median that seems to work well, and you plug it in. And if it fulfills that destiny, or that what it did in the past, there's a very high likelihood it may repeat it again. That's basically the premise.
Well, I mean, we could get technical for hours about it. It's very let me be sort of philosophical here about this. I don't know that the way we're using this is the best way to use it. I don't know if this is the only way. I know it's not the only way. And there are certainly people out there that could probably look at the data and find really creative ways to use what we're finding. I have found something, and it indicates things, but I know there's got to be, even more spectacular ways to use this.
Well, here's the bottom line, and we've been looking at this now for in real life trading now.
Real trading for almost 2 years. It's been almost
actually a little over 2 years, because we started in the beginning, I think, of 2018 when we were first giving
That's when you were bugging me. That's
right. And back then, I had originally gathered a group of people, and I think I threw out about 70 signals, and we had something close to a 90% win rate on those 70 signals. Now, things changed a little bit, and then we finally decided to launch the business later that year. So it was in October of 2018 that we launched it, but we were trading it and testing it the whole time. And then now we're up to hundreds and hundreds of different instances that we had tried. And it seemed to be honing in on a number. It seemed that we were maybe getting approximately 20% of the signals that were usable. In other words, we would say that they triggered, or they fulfilled the what if. And then those that triggered and fulfilled the what if were about 80 to 85% accurate. In other words, they reached the target that it predicted that it would reach, or at least came to it, or even exceeded it.
Okay, so let me clarify a couple of things here. I'm as you know, I'm not super comfortable with. I don't have my spreadsheet in front of me can tell you exactly how many have been winners versus losers and all that. But that's not what PatternCast does. PatternCast takes the scenario and says, this is the ballpark within which we believe the game is going to be played. So let's take, for example, if we think that a pattern is triggered and there's an entry price of, let's say, $10 on whatever the vehicle is, what that means is that somewhere above 10 and somewhere below 10, with 10 being a sweet spot, historically, that was the season or the time to have made your best purchase. Now, is that going to be the exact price today? No, and many times the entries are a little bit below or a little bit above, but that's not, PatternCast doesn't tell you push this button and this exact thing happens.
Yeah.
Once it's triggered, then you get, and by the way, Ernie, I don't even know why we're talking about all this technical stuff.
What I'm trying to express to people is that it's just whatever the statistics are, and I have gone over through hundreds and hundreds of signals and figured out different stats, and it changes over time, but it seems to be honing in on something that is absolutely clear, and that is that it gives you an incredible edge on individual assets.
Right. And see, and that's what that's so for me, when I look back at the evolution of all of this, early on, I felt like, we'd find the holy grail where you just push a button and get an exact entry and exact exit. That is, statistically, and I've looked at so many spreadsheets, I don't see that as being possible, certainly given the technology that we've got today. That kind of prediction, I don't see that. But the edge that you get in terms of, was this a better time to buy or better time to sell? That I would put this up against anything. I will not trade without this. And I know people who email me and say, hey man, please don't ever stop putting out these signals. And I mean, we're really going along on something here that people are probably falling asleep listening to. This is why I don't like to get into discussions of the how and the why.
Yeah, but this is all building up here to this one thing that we're here to talk about, and that is these macro signals, because everything that I was just describing was the individual signals that we were applying to assets. Now what we're doing is combining all of that into this one macro signal, and now we're able to really get a really good feel for and feel comfortable about which way the market's going.
Well, last week is a good example of really two ways to use PatternCast. And if you don't mind, I'll share my screen and you can
sure. Because it's giving us not only timing, but direction. And we're still struggling a little bit to understand the actual, velocity or strength of those signals. But we have it's getting more and more clear over time.
Well, this chart, can you see the chart I put up?
Yeah.
Okay. So this chart is a chart of the macro signal, the actual number that we're using. And over there on the bottom right, you see it says sell 24.4. That red dot represents where the macro signal actually hit the low for the year. And that was the night that you and I put out our videos on selling the market short. You can see that bottom on the chart just so happens to coincide with what was the top for the market for that time. Then over the next 4 or 5 sessions, the macro number climbed, and then that green dot was the day of the low of the market. And that was the high on the macro signal for that period. So what we're seeing is that as the macro signal climbs, we find better entries to buy, and as it falls, we find better exits to sell. And this week was a great example of that. We got that wonderful sell signal at 24.4, and then it wasn't until you got that high of 31, I think that was 31.25 on that, where that green dot is. And that was what we'll call, quote, the bottom. I don't know if it's the bottom for all time. So watching this happen in real time is kind of cool because you can use PatternCast, in my opinion, as kind of a barometer for which way the market's heading, or is it getting better for this or worse for that? And on the extreme ends, that's where we find the really nice entries and exits. And that sell at 24.4 is an example of that.
And what we're going to do going forward is we're going to be using that tool to communicate this out to the rest of the world and to demonstrate just how powerful this is. And I think after a little while, people are going to start really seeing exactly what we have here.
We did something in real time on our channels last week. I don't know how much more open and transparent we can be than what we did, was it last 2 Sundays ago, where we said, look, this is the signal. This is what we think it means. This is what we're going to do. And this was the range we thought it would happen in. And PatternCast gives me the confidence to feel like if this happens, like you were talking about, then this other thing, and these macro signals have really they've crystallized, a theme and a strategy for me of trading where I can use large groups, thousands of patterns, and now over almost 100 vehicles to get that one number every evening. And at least I think it gives me a fantastic edge. And I think last week, for those that were watching, showed you, I think, the power of PatternCast. We get that low signal, dive bombing, low for the year. The market rolls over. That was the top for that time period. Then, in fact, it was the top all the way since the lows in March. Then we get the moving back up of the signal. It goes to a many month high or a couple month high, and that's where that bottom is, and the market starts going back up again. I mean, we did this live.
Yeah.
I don't know how much more transparent. And so you can go back and watch this video later. And some people ask me for the data. I send them the data. You can look at it yourself. Now, what you would need every night is you need the new macro number, and that's what we come up with each evening. So if you want to follow the actual macro number each evening, you need to be able to get those signals to be able to track it. But
well, all I see is something that's unbelievably exciting, because seeing it happen, and as opposed to just sort of describing it to somebody, they're two different things, and that's what we're going to show going forward. You're going to see it happen, and there's going to be a point where you just cannot deny that this is something that you have to have in your.
You use such hyperbolic language. I don't use that language. I don't know if people deny it or not. I don't know. I just know that if people are thinking and they're interested and they're curious, they should track what we do, and they should track these macro signals. And like right now, I don't have a new signal I'm doing something with yet. I mean, I'm going to, look at the numbers tonight, but I don't think there's anything new. So I'm waiting for a better time to sell. I know the market made that strong move, but I don't believe, based on the macro number as I know it to be this evening, that we have a classic sell macro number. So the market might pull back a little bit. I don't know, but I'm not touching this as a sell. In fact, earlier today when the Dow was up about 600 points or so, I had my hand reaching for my mouse to maybe click and go short. I grabbed my hand and I pulled it back and said, we don't have a signal yet. And it ran up another 300 points or so. So I'm just saying right now, it's a strong candidate that over the next week or so, I would expect we'll get a selling opportunity. But today was not that day.
I guess what I'm saying, Don, is that it has instilled a lot of confidence in us in the technology, because it's proven itself so many times. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm excited about showing other people.
Right.
This thing is consistent.
Yeah, so if you, let me give me one more second sharing something with you. If you look at this chart over there on the left-hand side, that first move down to the lows, that first sharp move down sort of at 1/3 of the way across on the chart, that was right before the market rollover in February.
Yeah, that was February 18th.
February 18th, 19th, somewhere there. Then over there on the top, all those crazy high spikes, that was the market. Those are the signals as the market was selling off into the bottom in March. And then we get over here on the right, again, the macro numbers just coming all the way back down again to what we use as our sell signal for last week. So over time, we're learning. We're learning what these numbers seem to indicate. And I won't trade without it. I'll just tell you right now, I'm not going to make a trade without it. People can do what they want, follow it or not, but I won't trade without it.
It's fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks a lot, Don.
Thanks for having me on. And I think you should cut out about 90% of this discussion. It was super boring.
All right. Take care.
See you.